So the first place that we're going to go to is Matthew chapter number 12. Matthew chapter number 12. Verse number 40. And the reason that we're reading that is because, and you've heard me say this repeatedly down through the years, we talk about Jesus dying that death that we die on the cross as if the penalty for sin was that he died. The death that we recognize as the death that we die. And that death is the first death. So I'll call it the first death. We look at his death on the cross and hold that death up as if that first death is the penalty for sin. And we look at that death as such. We additionally look at his being hanged on a cross as if that was the price that was to be paid for the sin that Adam sinned and passed down through all of humanity, to the point that we've lifted that wooden beam up, those wooden cross beams up, we've lifted them up, and almost on the verge of idolatry, worship the cross beams, the cross, and hold them in such high regards. And listen again, there's nothing wrong with them hanging around our necks or anything. There's nothing wrong with them being in our church. Because what I tell people is this: what God does sometimes is he puts the visible before us because we can't see the invisible. And we can use that visible as the reference point, but what he tells us is his fear is that when we see the visible, we'll stop there and begin to relish the visible and not recognize that that is no more than a sign of something else that is greater if we can break through that visible. So babes need to see the visible. Adults need to, those that are mature and meat eaters need to go for the invisible. Well, Jesus had to do the same thing. Now, for example, in Ephesians, how can one understand the mystical relationship? Let's go there for a minute so that you can see this. Let's go to Ephesians. How can one understand the mystical relationship that exists? Make sure that we go there first. It's got to be in Ephesians. I do it all the time. It's got to be Ephesians chapter 5. Yep, it is Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 5. I have a lot of notes pinned to my Bible. How can we understand the mystical relationship that exists between Christ and the church? That's spiritual. It's profound. He's the groom and the Gentile church is the bride. To what degree and to what height does he love this church? How does the church respond to him, and then how does he respond to the church? How do we understand that? We can't understand the spiritual. That's why he talked in parables. Parables are talking about things that you see, to explain that you can't see because it would be difficult. We can't understand God, so he talks about himself as a man because we can't understand him. But be careful that we don't think that he has 5 fingers, 10 fingers and 10 toes and a head and a neck and a body. That's just how he references himself. How do we understand this mystical relationship that takes place between God and the church? So in Ephesians chapter 5, beginning with verse number, oh my goodness, I gotta get verse number 21, he begins talking about the ideal marriage, which is not what we're here to go into. Just to give the example. This is the ideal marriage. No marriage has arisen to that point, because it's the ideal, it's the superlative. Everyone strives to get there. My marriage hasn't reached that. But what is God's view on marriage? When I do marriage counseling, what is God's view on marriage? And I go here. And there are things in here that causes women to recoil, and there are things in here that causes men to recoil. There are certain responsibilities in the interrelationship between men and women, and certain reciprocities, etc., that are found there that cause us to recoil. And I say to everyone that I've talked to, if I find a marriage that meets that standard, which I don't think exists in the earth, because God is saying that's the superlative, then that would be the marriage to take a look at. But this is the ideal marriage in the way that it's supposed to work. And so Paul talks about marriage. It talks about the wife, talks about the husband and their responses to each other. And you would think that from verse number 22, verse 23, verse 24, verse 25, verse 26, verse 27, verse 28, verse 29, verse 30, it's talking about marriage, and you would think that that's what this is about. And then Paul pulls a switcheroo on us at verse number 32. And I tell those that I'm counseling, because the first phase of the counseling that I do is the perfect marriage, God's view. And then at the conclusion of talking about that, when I get to verse 31, I get to verse 32. And at verse 31, I says, now what have we been talking about all this time? And the people that I'm counseling says, you've been talking about marriage. I tell them, I have not been talking about marriage. Because verse number 32, Paul says, I was not talking about marriage, but I was talking about the relationship between Christ and the church. But he used marriage as the example. He wasn't talking about marriage, but to get us to understand the relationship between Christ and the church, he had to talk about marriage. And so then I say to the people that I'm counseling, if someone were to come to me, if some young innocent babe were to come to me and said, Pastor, can you explain to me what this mystical relationship is that exists between the church? I told the couple that I'm talking to, the engaged couple, I told them what I should say to them is, I'm going to ask brother and sister so-and-so who are already married if you could come and spend a month with them. And I want you to go and spend a month with them, and I want you to come back and I want you to tell me, what did you see and observe? And after you tell me what you saw and observed, I'm supposed to say to you, that is the relationship that exists between Christ and the church. Probably when they come back, would they tell me that they saw and observed, I'd have to say, no, that is not the relationship that exists between Christ and the church. But what I'm saying is we have to have a visual reference point, because we are natural. For that reason, he tells us to look to the cross. Those cross beams, look to the cross, look to that death. But for those that want to go beyond that, Jesus did not come to die the first death and that be considered the price being paid for our sins. So then, if he paid, well, let me give you this example. If he paid the price, does that not mean that we don't have to pay that price? Okay, I just want you to talk with me. I was going to Canada. I thought I'd try because I read it somewhere. So I did it. I went to Canada, and when I got to the guard booth and I paid what I was supposed to pay, I gave another amount and said, this is for the car behind me. And then I drove off and I looked through the rearview mirror. That car paused for a few minutes, You know, because you asked the question at another booth and then go pay. Paused for a few minutes and came through. The reason that that person didn't have to pay the price is because I paid the price. The death that we don't have to endure is not the first death, because we dying. The death that we don't have to endure is the second death.